So we now need to move on to the task of actually rating your risk categories. Now it's important to understand that this task allows us to rate the categories, and once we've identified the key categories that are impacting your organization, we'll take the next step of servicing the specific risks we'll be including in the risk register. So this is just a category analysis to find the general areas of risk which are occurring. As an overview, what we're going to be doing is for each risk element, what we're going to do is try to evaluate both the impact of a risk occurring and its likelihood. And based on that, we'll get a visual representation of the risk likelihood or the risk experience that may be occurring. And as we add that up across the risk categories, we may discover that there are significant risk elements involved that we need to build out. In other cases, there may be no risk and we don't need to worry about those particular risk categories. Likewise, we can add these up horizontally and begin to see whether any particular strategic objectives are at risk. And as a result of this analysis, we'll be able to make some decisions about what things we should include in our risk register and what things, although have a risky element, are not significant enough for us to consider at this point in time. So let's walk through the rating process in more detail. I'm going to give you a framework, but you will need to modify this for how your organization thinks and works. So if we're to zoom in on just one part of the spreadsheet, in this case we're looking at the economic risk against profitable growth. What we're going to do first off is consider what is the impact. And specifically what this looks at is what is the impact if this risk were to occur on that strategic objective. So in this particular case, we're taking a look at the economic risk against the strategic objective of profitable growth. So we're going to use a scale of 1 to 5, which is a standard risk framework, where 1 represents an insignificant impact, all the way up to 5 being catastrophic. Now, there are many definitions of what this scale looks like. The most common one comes out of 3100 ISO, and the framework here describes it as follows: minor, which is sort of a noticeable disruption; moderate is a material deterioration in results; major is a significant deterioration; severe is a fundamental threat to operating results; and catastrophic is threatening the survival of the organization. Now, this PowerPoint deck will be available below this webinar, and you may want to modify these definitions to better suit your company. But you get the overall gist of how we describe these things. And your team eventually will have to normalize what is a 1 for them compared to a 5. The net is we'll be using this framework to come up with a score. So in this example, we've decided that the economic risk's impact on profitable growth is 3, moderate. So now let's move on and talk about likelihood. Likelihood is the likelihood of that particular risk occurring and impacting that strategic objective. So in the example we're working with, what is the likelihood that an economic risk will occur, and if it does occur, it impacting profitable growth? And again, there's a standard scale of 1 to 5 that risk people use, where 1 says rare up to a scale of 5, which is almost certain. And again, there's definitions available that sort of fit this, whether it's probabilities or examples. And again, your team is going to have to eventually normalize what they perceive a 1 to be compared to a 5 and the scores in between. The net is we'll come out with a score, and once you enter that score, the software will give you a visual representation through a bar graph in conditional formatting of what that risk looks like. In fact, once you have completed that risk across all strategic objectives, it'll begin giving you a bit of a view of what that risk category looks like compared to others. And in fact, to analyze these results, we'll be able to both take a look at the risk category itself. So in this case, the category is economic risk, and it has a black Harvey ball, which represents compared to all the other risks that you've analyzed, it seems to have a high likelihood of occurring and significant impact on the organization. So it's a risk that should be worth considering. In this example, industry risk has a 1/4 Harvey ball, which may not be worth the team's time considering, at least in the first pass. We are doing this work in order to understand what risk categories we'll need to build out in the next step. But out of interest, we can also add these up horizontally and begin to see what is the level of risk that these categories infer may be occurring against each strategic objective. Now, we're not going to do anything with that information, but it will be available to you. Now, ultimately, if we take a look at the overall sheet, we'll discover that some of those risk categories have a black or a 3/4 black Harvey ball. And those are ones that you will probably want to include in your risk registry and the further analysis that's going on. There are others that may have a moderately less risk element, and you may choose to include those, again, in the risk registry and the risk scorecard and so forth. Or, depending on your team's scoring, there may be enough just taking a look at the black and 3/4 black Harvey balls to determine what it is. The net is, to begin with, we're recommending you identify 10 to 15 risk categories that you want to progress this analysis on. Later on, you can come back and build out the rest. I mentioned that your team will have to normalize what they perceive to be a 1 versus a 5 and the scores in between. In fact, it needs to be carefully moderated because there's a risk perception skew that occurs. And here's the issue. To a greater or less extent, all of us desire a risk-averse environment or knowledge of certainty. And that desire leads to blind spots in how we analyze these risks, both in terms of their probability and their impact. And specifically, there are several risks of bias that we see. One is an availability bias, which means your team will tend to overestimate instances which have just recently occurred in the organization or are easy to imagine. There's the illusion of control, where sometimes people believe they can control events around a certain risk and therefore will rate the impact of that risk lower because they believe they have the structure and mitigation techniques in place to control them. There's sort of what's called a confirmation bias, which is where people tend to, once they've committed to a particular score, they will only accept information that confirms the score they have as opposed to that contradicts it. So it becomes hard to move your team once they get fixed on an idea. And that's related to groupthink, where the ability to analyze that risk diminishes as a result of the group pressures on the individuals. And then finally, there's a feeling of dread. I mean, here's the thing. There are certain activities that all of us dread, and therefore thinking about that incurs a higher perceived risk, and the more that person will want that risk reduced. And therefore, it sort of elicits feelings of terror, uncontrollable catastrophe, and so on. A simple example here is 9/11. You know, we would not have imagined that to be a real risk before it happened, but now it has, and the severity of that event now has a feeling of dread associated with it. So as you manage your team, you need to walk them through these issues and help them have a risk-free environment that allows them to more accurately score their perception of each of these risks.